Welcome to another episode of Out of Bounds on the Boomer Bust channel. I'm your host, Terry, and today talking about race and racism. Not going to go super long, but just kind of a general overview conversation about it. You know, we live in a time where we still have a lot of social unrest. Some people think it's over and done. I wouldn't say never, but it won't be over and done for a long time because there's a lot of reconstruction to do. But in the midst of everything that happened last year, we had a swelling of, I think, just racial discourse and obviously feelings and whatever on both sides. To the point you had a lot of people, maybe not with the best intentions, but a lot of people trying to dive into these conversations, trying to buy the books, trying to watch the videos, the documentaries, listen to the podcasts, read the articles. A lot of people really trying to get into what's the whole discussion. And beyond just police brutality in those conversations, I think in the year we are, where today is the most information we've had available ever, and people have platforms to say what they want to say or to share things. I think a lot of people are at a point where they're not going to just sit down and let things happen if they can, shed light on it. So there's just, been a lot more of that discussion. Not that it has never been a thing. And I'll probably soon be doing my review of The Wire, which I finally just watched. But one of the first impressions I had is like, literally, if it wasn't for the technology, I would think this was 2021. Like, all the conversations is literally like they were just happening right now. And there's plenty of other art and media. There's plenty of other things that are from a while ago that have discussed the same issues that we're having today. So one of the biggest things, I think, obviously there's just pure ignorance and bias, and to the point that people have a material reason to be ignorant of racism or to feed into racism. But beyond all that, I think the average person is just misinformed. Like a lot of things, we don't really know and understand information, which is always funny because we're in a time, like I said, where you can get the information, but people don't take the time to. And really, these discussions are so heavy sometimes that people get their emotions wrapped into it and don't really want to understand what the other people are saying. And so oftentimes I think we're talking with two different languages, not obviously not literally, but when you say one thing to somebody that means something to you, but something totally different to them, is going to cause disagreement or misunderstanding. And so to talk about this idea of race and racism, and we'll start with race, which is probably more of an easier explanation than racism, but they do go together, obviously. So race, when we talk about race, everybody, I would say in our country, takes it for granted because we are a racialized country. A lot of the stuff that we see is in race, and so we take it as kind of fact, and it's not. Race was created, and not in the sense of, it's a social construct like a man or like a person, a human made it up. Obviously, we know everything kind of came that way, but literally it was created out of thin air for bad intentions and not really to capture anything that's true. Like, obviously, if you talk about ethnicity and where you come from, even nationality, that's a very concrete fact. If you talk about this idea of sex, male, female, chromosomes, genetics, that stuff is rooted in some fact. When you talk about race was literally just created and has changed over time. The fact is, people right now think it's so much about the pigmentation of your skin, and that's not really the case. Those who have been considered white has changed. There was times, I think, hopefully some people know, there was times where Italians and Irish mainly, but other groups as well, were not considered white people. And it's not always white versus black. I think the more appropriate term would be white versus non-white. And that has a long history in this country, and others. The truth of the matter is, this was a concept created by the expanding European empire as a reason and an excuse to expand their slave trade, and to make it more, I would say, not only expansive, but to make it more prevalent than it already was. And the way they chose to go about that was with this classification of race, much like they classify animals, species of animals and species of plants and all that with this taxonomy. And so they, like pretty much anybody else, use the authority figures, the scientists, the writers of the day, to produce this stuff that tried to say scientifically, we are in different races, and these different races have different characteristics, different abilities, thoughts, whatever. And obviously in the hierarchy of everything, you had the white people on top. They were civilized. They were the ones that were smarter, blah, blah, blah. And effectively what they really wanted to do is say that those that are black or African, really, it was mostly African at the time, they are of lesser species. They were created to be ruled, to live in servitude. They are naturally born to endure hard labor. They're not as smart. They're not civilized. They're heathens. And so that propaganda is what was used to fill the society to allow slaves. Like, you think about it now, and I mean, obviously with our history, but let's just say we didn't have that history. Let's just say we were all living here peacefully like we wish we were. And then one day the government tried to say, all right, we're going to enslave black people. They're not going to have rights and whatnot. How do you think they were able to accomplish that? How were they able to get people across all different, areas to believe in that? I mean, because you had a European society and who become settlers in other places, but also other places in the world too, to really believe in this. And this was one of the ways they did this. And so this concept of race was propaganda, much like anything else you see, the minstrel shows, the racist movies back then, the racist political cartoons and stories and all that. All these things that were used to dehumanize and devalue people of a certain skin color, and to say that they were not as good. And this is our excuse of why we're enslaving them, because we're going to civilize them. We're going to make them better. Or they just, by God, were designed to be servants, and we were made to rule. It's the natural order of things. And there's some people, white supremacists, that still believe that. And so this concept evolves over time. It gets really rooted. And to the point, some people go along with it. Some people start to believe it. And then it evolves over time. Again, you get into the eugenics era, where they started to go for the science route. Because I think the original race really, while there was a push for the science community, it mostly stemmed in this religious idea. There's a time where people were much more religious, and this idea that God wanted us to rule these people. And it's, whatever. Then you get to eugenics, survival of the fittest. After hundreds of, or not hundreds, but probably after a long time of settlement, colonization, and then turning into America, after a long history of that, you get to this point where people start to say those who are in power and who are doing what they do is because survival of the fittest. Like, they're no longer saying that God chose this race, but the natural order of the nature is that we came out on top because we're smarter, because we're the strongest, we're the superior race. And this idea again of eugenics and talking about what's genetically true about each race. This race has this and this race has that. This race is smarter. This race is stronger. This race is this. And all these characteristics that you know as stereotypes today come out of this thought. And this idea that was being pushed heavy in America with eugenics was carried out by Hitler in Germany. And that was one of the main thrusts kind of behind their attack on different races as well. And so that's stuff that comes from, not comes from, but was popularized a lot in America before Hitler even ran with that. And so now it's science. Science is eugenics. And then eventually true science proves our genetic material is very similar, 99%. That there are no major differences genetically between the races, which again was created. It's hard to say that it's true when race isn't even a real thing. And so over time, for political reasons, people started to change. You know, as minority numbers change, people wanted to adopt, the powers that be chose to adopt other groups into the category of white, and so that they could have more white people. And the race thing is really powerful. Obviously, it dehumanized black people, but it's really powerful because it kept the poor white people engaged. It kept them going along with this. And so you think about this idea that poor, servitude type work people who were white way back when, and they weren't, the polished, fancy, aristocrat type. They might have felt isolated being poor. But once this concept of white comes out, white pride, and really like this eugenics idea of you're the better race, now all of a sudden they feel some type of connection to those white people in power. They're like, they look like me, so I'm like that. Even though I don't have their money, I'm better than a black person. And so that's why a lot of poor white people did and continue to support these ideas, because it gave them some type of sense of entitlement. People talk about Martin Luther King and civil rights. He was killed because he started to talk about black economic prosperity, but also within that, he's talking about poor white people too. He's talking about two Americas, and he's talking about the economic disparity, what some people would call the 1% nowadays. And even when you're talking about, I forgot his name, Fred Hampton, who they just did the movie on. You saw even in that movie, this was somebody that was starting to gather people from different ways. It wasn't just all black people. It wasn't just black and brown. It was also poor white people too, where they start to see this common goal of oppression and this lie of race that kind of held them in place. And that's when he became real dangerous to the government. So this idea of race, again, it oppressed black people, but it really, what it does is that it empowered poor white people to be part of this system. So that's race. And then racism. The reason that this becomes such an issue is because a lot of people think of it as types of actions. Some people think of it as feelings or thoughts. And then there's a lot of discussion about systems. Now, I think for the purpose of the discussions we're having historically and contemporary, racism has to do with systems. It is action too, but we're mainly talking about systems and institutions. And to some people that's very vague, but it is what we all know. It's institutions like healthcare, like education, like law enforcement and the justice system, even voting and our democracy, these institutions that build a civilization, are steeped in a lot of racist history, and some of those practices and whatnot come today. And so, again, the reason people get so confused is because we don't have that same definition of racism. And so somebody say, I'm not a racist. In their mind, they could really be believing that. They say, I haven't called nobody the N-word. I haven't actively tried to block somebody from getting a job. I haven't tried to hurt anybody. Like, I'm not a racist. And at the same time, you'll have somebody that's African American or whatnot, Latino, anybody say, I'm not racist because I can't be racist. I don't have the power to be racist. Like, those both statements are true to them because we're not talking about the same things. And so when I'm talking about racism and getting it to my definition, like I said, it is about the systems and institutional level. It's and the issue is that means everything. Everything we do in America has been influenced by our racialized systems, because the media and everything and entertainment, that's all part of it. Those are things and tools that have been used, as I mentioned, for a long time to push out propaganda. And so from the stereotypes you see in movies and TV shows and the jokes you hear, from the type of toys that they sell kids and the type of things they teach in school, from the way that people talk about in academic articles and everything, like the eugenics, like these different, like right now, the fight against critical race theory, all these things permeate our whole world. And so it racializes everything we see, and to the point where more people understand this now. But for a long time, people didn't understand implicit bias. And this idea that you could have these deep-seated psychological thoughts about other people, even though you're not actively thinking about it or exercising it, it influences your decisions. And so with that, I do think when I'm discussing racism, it's on that larger level, but it is still action because it's how you contribute to it. And I still don't feel like I'm a person that's like, either you're with us or against us, either you're helping or you're hurting. I'm not one of those people, but you do have to be critical of your everyday movements and actions to see how you might be contributing to the racist system or how you're challenging it. And so, you know, even these ideas, like one thing right now that's at this very moment, not like, you know, in the last few years, but at this very moment, a big conversation in the community is about bonnets and black women wearing bonnets in public. And people have different opinions and all that, but on a regular level of this conversation, you can just say, yeah, I think it's appropriate to wear it. No, I don't. Here's my reasons. But when you're being critical, when you're really looking at it in a racialized lens and you say that's not appropriate, you have to ask yourself, appropriate to who? Who made appropriate? Like, you really have to get deep. When you think about that's appropriate to wear, that's not. Why do you think it's appropriate? Where did you learn that from? And who, the person that taught you, where did they learn it from? Like, people say a suit and a tie is appropriate for this occasion. Who set that standard? And I'm not saying at the end of the day you can't agree or disagree, but you really have to investigate to yourself who is the one that set that standard and why they set that standard. Because I will tell you what, most of the time when we're talking about appropriate, it's by a white standard. It is traced by what has been deemed appropriate in our history by white people, mostly white men. And so, again, having that ability to challenge those narratives and to really criticize it. And I don't mean criticize it as in, hate on it and blah, blah, blah. Like everybody thinks everything criticism means hate. No, I mean to challenge it and analyze it and really think about where do those ideas come from. And like I said, from the food we eat, the music we listen to, the news, the products we buy, everything, trust me, has a racialized component. And I bring up The Wire one more time because it's a great example of just the many institutions and how things play out. And so one of the issues we have now, the biggest issue, contemporary, is that racism has evolved into individual versus the system. And so people want to say, why you keep bringing up race? What does race have to do with it? This person got in trouble because they did something, or this person got killed by the cops because they did something, or this cop killed somebody. It's not all cops. And so while I don't believe we need to talk in generalizations to the point where we're saying everybody that looks like this does this. No. But what I am saying is, it's not just this individual, oh, you're a bad person, you made a bad choice. You have to look at the environment that person came up in and why that environment was set that way. It's a long list of issues that all stem from racism that put us in the situations we are now. And it's not everybody, obviously. You know, LeBron James and his children, they're not in those same conditions as some other people are right now. And so, no, they're not going to have the same outcomes. But that's when we talk about numbers. Disproportionately, that's where we see black and brown people affected negatively way more than anybody else. So if the country is made up, and I'm not using actual numbers, just saying, if the country is made up of 10% black people, and the prisons have 40% black people, there's a problem. Because how does 10% of your entire population still feed 40% of your prisons? That tells you there's an issue. And same thing with violent crime and everything else. That's why we talk about proportions, to say in general how we're impacted. That doesn't mean we all act the same and do the same thing, but we're impacted overall worse than other people. And so again, this idea of racism, I think, was productive to talk about, is how these systems, how these traditions really affect the way we live today, and challenging those, or really looking at that and say, does that make sense, or is there a better way we can do this? So that's, I think, the first of many conversations to come out of this, but that was just kind of my quick discussion about race and racism. So definitely go to the comment section. Let me know what you think. Share it around, get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you for going out of bounds.